The cry split the iron dust air of the outpost like a blade, slicing clean through the wheeze of condensation harvesters and the distant thump of excavation rigs. It wasn't a sound bounded by dialects or biology. It was pure, elemental suffering, the kind only a child can make when their small universe breaks in half. 9-year-old Sira Halon sagged against the corrugated rim of the communal cistern. Her limb folded at a wrong angle that made the watching colonists flinch. Pale phosphorescent models along her teal flesh jittered and stuttered, idiotically broadcasting distress her muscles couldn't stop. A ragged overlay of membrane, what off-worlders would call skin but which was far more fragile here, had split across her shin, revealing the pallid rose tissue beneath. Her learning slate lay fractured a few meters away, its ghostly figures still attempting to solve equations for a gravity the machine no longer believed in. Mara Halen abandoned the supply crates she'd been stacking. The chutes and boxes thudded into the packed oxidized soil, sending tiny eddies of rusted grit into the cooling air. She moved with the blind speed of someone whose mind had gone straight to animal instinct, protective, urgent, not thinking about exhaustion. Her legs carried her in a few long bounds. The bioluminescent bands along her shoulders flared like alarm lanterns. The settlement, New Meridian, hewn into the iron-scarred face of Chorus. Prime's rust fields suddenly felt cavernous and deserted. 3 Gorek lads, who'd been pushing at the edges of the communal thoroughfare, kept their forward momentum. Their gray hides were already knitting calloused plates across the shoulders that would someday protect them in the strip mines. Now their adolescent cockiness carried them past. They didn't glance back. Their tails flicked with a cruel little rhythm as they melted between prefab dwellings, the kind of boys who learned their morality from scarcity, and the long shifts of parents. In the deep shafts, people whispered their names in the market the way one mentions storms. Inevitable and best avoided. Mara dropped to her knees beside Sira, her 4-fingered hands trembling, enough to make the emergency bandage tremble loose. The twin suns hung low, throwing the world in bruised orange and washed crimson. But inside Mara's chest it felt like an evening that had never known warmth. She tried to call up the emergency drills they'd practiced after arrival. The clean checklist taught in the cargo module. Grief and fear fogged every line. All she could focus on was the small, pinched face of her child and the grotesque wrongness of that folded limb. "Ma?" Sira breathed, a fragile, halting sound, her large amethyst eyes catching the softer light, tears drifting down in languid lines. "It hurts. It hurts so much." "I know, small comet," Mara said, her voice thin but steady as she fumbled for the wrist console. Her words were an attempt to steady both of them. "I've got you." She keyed the transmitter with fingers that shook. "This is Mara Halon at Block 3. Medical emergency. My daughter is injured. Possible fracture to the left leg. Request immediate med response." The reply came with professional distance, and the crisp delay of a system stretched thin. "Copy, medical unit dispatching now. ETA 4 minutes. Advise, do not move the patient. Keep airway clear and monitor for shock. 4 minutes, on a fringe colony, where the nearest full hospital was more than 2 systems away and the clinic was a converted freight pod manned by 1 tired surgeon and a pair of techs. 4 minutes felt like an unlit eternity. Mara's eyes burned as she searched the small cluster of bystanders for a face that would not look away. Most had already turned their backs, fatigue and learned indifference doing the work of cruelty, or simply too worn to hold another person's calamity. She did not at first hear the low thrum of engines, different from the usual tractor carts, a tone that carried a metallic bite. She did not look up when 5 silhouettes on heavy hovercycles rolled toward the settlement's southern gate, the riders' outlines cutting against the slow fall of the suns. Her hands stayed on Sira's head ridges, fingers moving in a rhythm the child recognized, whispering the same assurances one would give a frightened animal. "Stay with me, little star," Mara murmured, breath warm against Sira's forehead. "Help's coming." Above them, the horizon swallowed. The suns and the settlement shrank to the size of a handful of promises. The 5 riders eased their machines into a cautious approach, engines whining down to conversational pitch, the nearest lantern skimming the dust and throwing long shadows toward the wounded pair. The hovercycles were not the everyday transport carts of miners. They rode heavier, armored plates glinting at odd angles, a presence neither wholly familiar nor entirely benign in the slow twilight of Chorus Prime. Human riders were an uncommon sight this deep into the frontier. Most settlements brimmed with off-worlders, not people from Earth's tighter systems. So the 5 machines gliding toward New Meridian turned heads. Their clothing read like a ledger of hard choices. Long dusters stitched with heat mesh. Scavenged armor plates lashed across shoulders, wide-brimmed shields rigged to mute the sun's fierce glare. Their mounts were civilian grav bikes retrofitted with military-grade guts. Exhausts blackened and hulls nicked from 1,000 crossings over hostile ground. At the front rode Jonas Hale. He tipped the brim of his hat with a scarred knuckle as he watched the med unit streak for the cistern. Time had creased his face. A map drawn by too many suns and too many things seen. A salt gray beard framed a jaw, marked by a long pale seam that ran from temple to chin, a souvenir from the Ashen Revolt, 8 years back that haunted the dreams of every veteran who'd stood in that line. "Hold," Jonas said, low and precise, a voice that had learned to make men listen. The 4 riders behind him killed their throttles without a word. The scream they'd all heard carried a shape their ears remembered. The jagged, animal terror of a parent's cry, the stunned hush that follows when something small is suddenly broken. "Kids hurt." Ellie, Nor offered, youngest of the group at 34 but carrying an age in his gaze. The war had left him with an optic neural implant that sharpened distant sounds. Now that gift made him the first to name what others felt. "Leg sounds bad." Jonas said nothing right away. He watched as the clinic shuttle slowed, medics leaping down to cradle the child, as the mother folded around her like a shelter. Something about the way she collapsed inward, a posture of helplessness, that made her whole frame seem to shrink, landed in Jonas's chest with an old familiar pain. Once before the revolt, before the convoy accident that took his wife and little girl, he had known a small hand in his. Maybe that was why the sight pierced him. Maybe it was simply that a man with long service couldn't ignore a naked wrong. An old reflex rose, shield those who could not shield themselves. "We don't get involved," said Silas Cade from the rear. But his tone betrayed him. At 52, he carried a veteran's steadiness. Decades of field medicine shaped his hands and his silences. "We're just passing through. We've got a drop to make for the Aldrich Mining Syndicate by dawn." Jonas swallowed. The words were sensible, a schedule to keep, agreements to honor, and yet he didn't fire his throttle. He watched the med van pull away, saw the mother climb in beside her child, saw the small knot of onlookers begin to thin. People turned from what hurt them as if by habit. Exhaustion had taught them to look away. "We're passing through," Eli repeated, but the bikes remained still. None of them moved. Nightfall on Chorus Prime came with its own cruel choreography. The twin suns slid down close together, producing a thin violet dusk that lasted only a handful of breaths before the larger moon lifted and washed the world in a cold pale green. Temperatures dove nearly 30 degrees in the space of an hour, driving colonists toward environmental suits or the uncertain warmth of sealed hab modules. A bitter wind picked up from the volcanic flats to the north, carrying the iron smell of rust and a faint sulfur note. The 5 riders made their camp at the fringe of the settlement, where traders usually left their rigs. They rolled out a compact atmospheric dome that hummed into life, carving a pocket of drinkable air so they could peel away helmets and breathe without Chorus Prime's metallic aftertaste. Over a fusion cell, they warmed ration bricks when the fuel dense, meals that tasted of necessity more than flavor, and spoke so little the silence felt like part of the meal. They had been moving for days. The road had hardened them into careful mouths and watchful eyes. They had traveled together long enough for wordlessness to feel natural, almost preferable to anything that required effort. But Jonas couldn't quiet his mind. The memory of the girl's cry kept looping in the dark behind his eyes. The mother's collapsed posture, the 3 Goric boys sprinting away without the slightest flicker of regret. "You're thinking loud again, Chief," murmured Ren Volter, their pilot and route mapper. A wiry man, flame-red hair gone mostly frost-white, and a knack for reading people that skirted the edge of uncanny. "If you've got a question, spit it out." Jonas set down the ration brick he'd barely eaten. The others were already watching him, waiting. Men who knew the shape of his conscience far too well. Those boys who shoved her, Jonas said slowly. They ran fast, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Probably did, Eli replied. Kid that young, and her species' bone mesh is softer than Gorek plating. A shove from kids their age? They'd know it could break something. So where are their parents? Jonas asked. Where's the part where someone steps in? Silas gave a dry, humorless grunt. This is the outer ring. Jonas, folks are too busy keeping their lungs working and their homes pressurized to worry about justice for one off-world child. And her people, what are they called, Lumeri? They only joined the galactic grid a couple decades back. The older colonies treat them like hatchlings who wandered too far from home. Jonas knew he was right. The Lumeri were newcomers to the wider star lanes, earnest and trusting in ways that made them targets. Their fragility wasn't biological, it was social. They hadn't learned the sharp edges of frontier life yet, and predators noticed that sort of thing. We could track down the boys, Ren said softly. Small settlement like this? Names spill fast. Someone always knows something. And then what? Silas countered. We aren't enforcers. We aren't advocates. We're 5 burnt-out ex-soldiers trying to make a clean living hauling crates. We start poking into local trouble, we risk contracts. We risk our name out here. Our name, Jonas echoed, his tone making the others sit up slightly. Meaning the name of 5 men who look away when a child gets hurt? A heavy stillness settled over the camp. It carried ghosts with it, ghosts of villages shelled into ash, of classrooms turned to smoke, of small bodies that should have grown older but never would. They had promised themselves when the war finally spat them back out that they were finished with battles, finished with heroics, finished with the kind of righteous interference that left graves behind. But Jonas was discovering that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of choices, and some choices refused to be ignored. Just information, Jonas said at last. We learn who the boys are, where they sleep. We talk to the parents. That's all. No threats, no fists, just consequences someone needs to speak aloud. It was a flimsy justification. Every man there felt the thinness of it. And yet it was also exactly who they had always been. Soldiers who tried, in whatever small ways they could, to protect those who couldn't fight back. Fine, Silas sighed. But we do it clean and quick. First hint of trouble, we walk. Jonas nodded, though every one of them understood the lie in that gesture. Finding names took far less time than any of them expected. Ren disappeared into the settlement's lone bar with a handful of credits, and 20 minutes later he returned with a pile of information so detailed it made Eli swear under his breath. In the frontier, gossip traveled faster than shuttles. The boys are Tovran brothers, Ren reported. Rex, Darnick, and Zelek. Father works 18-hour shifts in the deep core rig. Mother died in a cave-in 3 cycles ago, prefab hut, Sector 4C, and they've been pushing around smaller kids for years. Everyone knows. Nobody intervenes because the Tovran men pull good numbers in the mines, and good miners are scarce. System's rotten, Eli muttered. Little one could have been crippled, and nobody would have lifted a hand. System was always rotten, Silas replied quietly. And we didn't fix it in uniform. We're not going to fix it now. But Jonas was no longer sitting. He was already rising, already pulling on his coat, already making up his mind in a way the others recognized too well. Jonas checked the charge on his personal flux shield, the soft hum rising as he slipped his long coat over his shoulders. I'm not trying to fix anyone's system, he muttered to his squad. I'm just going to speak with a mother. The Halon dwelling sat on the far rim of the outpost, a prefab shelter weathered by too many cycles of grit storms. The outer seal on the door had been patched with strips of recycled polymer, and one of the side storage pods sagged at an angle, its metal struts corroded by Goran dust. But there were small, stubborn signs of someone trying to carve a life out of this brutal place, a loop of tiny solar lanterns around the doorframe. A smooth stone painted with 2 glowing moons, the symbol of the Lumeri twins. A narrow planter box where a fragile, off-world plant strained upward against the thin air. Jonas approached slowly. His boots grated on the dense, frozen ground, each breath curling into the cold night despite the atmospheric bubble maintained by his suit. Faint light pulsed behind the translucent window panels, and he could hear murmured voices inside. He raised his hand to knock, but his fingers hovered in the air as doubt crept in. What was he doing here? What could he possibly fix? Then that scream echoed in his memory. the one that hadn't belonged in any quiet afternoon. And he knocked. The door slid open with cautious slowness. Mara stood there, her eyes swollen from crying. The soft bioluminescent ribbons across her cheeks dimmed to a dull blue. She was taller than he'd realized earlier, nearly 2 meters, all elegant lines and long limbs. But now she carried herself with the posture of someone forced to bow beneath too many burdens. "Yes?" she asked, her voice thin and exhausted. Her common tongue was fluent but accented in the lilting way of her people. "What do you need?" Jonas removed his hat, an old Terran gesture hardly any off-worlders understood, but it felt appropriate. "My name is Jonas Hale," he said quietly. "I was nearby when your daughter was injured. I wanted to check on her, to make sure she's receiving proper care." Mara stared at him for a long, searching moment, as if trying to understand why a human soldier would concern himself with her child at all. "She is resting," she said at last. "The med-techs gave her dampeners for the pain and fitted her with a regenerative brace. They say her bones will mend, but slowly. She won't be able to attend her schooling. She can't move without assistance. She will need constant attention." The words spilled out of her in a rush. "As for me, I cannot stop working. I process filtration cycles at the water reclamation plant. They gave me 3 days leave, but after that, if I don't return," her voice cracked, "I lose the position entirely. And Sierra, she cannot be left alone. I cannot afford care services. And her father—" She stopped, eyes shifting away. Jonas didn't need her to finish the sentence. "The father wasn't part of the picture, whether by choice or by something darker. Ma'am," Jonas said gently, "I know who hurt your daughter. I know where they live, if you want to report it to the Outpost Council." Mara let out a short, bitter laugh with no trace of humor. "And what would the council do? Those boys are Gorak. Their father oversees the ore conduits. We Lumeri have been on this colony less than 2 years. You know how things work in the frontier sectors. Mr. Hale, some lives are weighted more heavily than others." Jonas felt something coil tightly inside his chest, an old, familiar anger he'd never managed to bury even after the war ended. "That isn't the way things should be." "No," she agreed softly. "It isn't, but fairness rarely survives long out here." Jonas stood silently for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. His squad waited a respectful distance away, giving him space. He thought about walking, off, getting back on his grav cycle, and leaving this struggling outpost behind. It would be safer, simpler, cleaner. But 8 years of wartime, simplicity had led him down roads that still woke him, breathless in the middle of the night. And turning away now felt like walking back into those shadows. "Ma'am," he said finally, lifting his gaze, "would you allow me to come inside? I brought something for your daughter, if it's all right." Mara hesitated, then stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Please, enter." Inside, the Halon home was small but meticulously cared for, the kind of order born from owning very little and valuing every piece of it. The main room was barely 4 meters across, with a compact cooking module along one wall and a narrow sleep niche visible through a side doorway. The air was warm, softly lit by bioluminescent strands coiled neatly along the ceiling. Inside the modest Halon home, a few treasured belongings rested on makeshift shelves crafted from repurposed cargo panels. Sierra lay on a cushioned platform that had been turned into a temporary bed, her injured leg propped up on folded blankets. The oversized thermal cover swallowed her small frame. Her natural bioluminescence flickered faintly, dim from fatigue and pain suppressants, her half-lidded eyes drifting in and out of awareness. Jonas knelt beside her, his joints protesting with quiet cracks. From inside his coat he drew out a small object, something he had carried far longer than he liked to admit. It was a soft toy, shaped like a little earth hound, its fur worn thin, its fabric patched in places. One ear had been reattached so many times the stitching looked like a mismatched timeline of old memories. It had once belonged to his daughter, and for reasons he still didn't fully understand, he had never let it go. "Hey, little one," he said, keeping his voice warm and gentle. "I'm Jonas. I heard today wasn't very kind to you." Sierra blinked at him, her eyes too solemn for a child her age. In them he recognized the early understanding of how the frontier worked, how some people's suffering mattered, and others didn't. "You are human," she whispered. "I have only seen a few." "We're not too common way out here," Jonas said. "But we're around. He lifted the toy. This is Bristle. She's brave, stubborn, too, and she's good at staying with people when they're hurting. Thought she might stay with you for a while. Sierra reached out cautiously, brushing the faded fabric with her fingertips. She looked up at him as tears pooled in her eyes. Why? She breathed. The question struck him harder than he expected. So simple, so honest, and so wrong that she needed to ask it at all. A galaxy this vast shouldn't leave a child unsure of why anyone would care. Because someone should, Jonas answered softly. Because you matter, Sierra, you and your mother. What happened to you wasn't right. He stood slowly, his knees cracking in protest, and turned to Mara. The ones who hurt her, I know who they are. Tomorrow my unit and I are going to go speak with their father. A spark of alarm flickered across her face, and he raised a calming hand. Not a threat, he assured her. Just one parent talking to another parent, making sure he understands what his sons did. Mara's voice faltered, caught between despair and a fragile sliver of hope. It will not change anything. People like us, we do not receive justice. We merely endure and pray the next sun cycle is kinder. Jonas settled his hat back onto his head. Maybe the next cycle can be kinder. Maybe someone just needs to stop letting things slide. He started toward the door, but Sierra's tiny voice called after him. Mr. Jonas, will you come back to visit Bristle? He turned. The little Lumeri girl clung to the stuffed hound, hugging it as if afraid it might vanish. Her mother watched him with tentative hope. A hope Jonas felt settling heavily on his shoulders. A promise forming before he even spoke it. Yeah, he said softly. I'll come back. Outside, his squad waited. They read the situation in his posture. In the silent way, he walked back toward their camp. None of them asked. They didn't have to. They understood that Jonas Hale had just signed them up for something far bigger than a delivery job, something that could overturn the quiet lives they'd carved out after the war. So, Eli finally said, we're actually doing this? Jonas looked at them one by one. Eli, the one who heard everything, and whose sense of justice was as sharp as his augmented hearing. Silas, the medic who hid his compassion behind dry humor and a surgeon's precision. Ren, the pilot who could never walk past. Someone in need without getting dragged into their story. And himself. An old soldier who kept swearing he was done fighting, only to find conflict waiting for him in every moral corner he turned. Yeah, Jonas said. We're doing this. The Tovran residence towered in contrast to the Halon home, reflecting the family's elevated status in the settlement's small hierarchy. Their prefab was a newer model, sleek panels, a reinforced atmospheric seal, a private water recycler, and a perimeter of scanning nodes that pulsed with quiet efficiency. It was the kind of home only someone with influence could afford. Jonas and his men approached mid-morning, when the twin suns were high enough to make the dust shimmer like liquid heat. Most of the outpost was either deep in their shifts or resting off the previous night's labor. When they reached the entrance, the door slid open to reveal Rex Tovran, the eldest of the three brothers, a juvenile, Gorik, already growing into the dense plating and thick ridge scales typical of his kind. He stared at the five humans with a curled lip, his tail lashing once behind him in open hostility. What do you want? He snapped. We need a word with your father, Jonas said evenly. Is he here? He's asleep. Pulled a double rotation. Come back later. The boy tried to shut the door, but Jonas stepped forward, calmly planting a boot against the frame. No, he said, his tone calm but immovable. Go wake him. Tell him Jonas Hale needs to speak with him about his sons. Something in Jonas's voice, steady, unyielding, cut straight through Rex's bravado. His expression faltered. Without another word, he backed away and disappeared down the corridor. Moments later, a massive Gorek male emerged. He wore sleep clothes still rumpled from rest, and his heavy-lidded eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion. But the moment he saw 5 armed veterans on his doorstep, alertness surged through him. I'm Dargan Tovran, he announced, voice carrying the gravelly undertone of his species. Explain why you're at my door. Yesterday, Jonas said, your son shoved a 9-year-old Lumeri girl off her glider near the water station. Her leg snapped badly. She'll be healing for months. I'm here to confirm you know what happened, and to understand what you intend to do about it. Dargan's jaw tightened. My boys said she toppled on her own. Clumsy little glowskin didn't know how to steer. They lied, Jonas replied, unblinking. I've got 3 witnesses who watched them shove her. So I'll ask again, what are you planning to do about it? The Goric crossed his thick arms, and in that posture, Jonas could suddenly see every shared trait between father and sons, the same dismissive glare, the same practiced indifference to the suffering of those beneath them. Listen, human, Dargan growled. I don't know who you think you are, marching onto my property and issuing demands, but I suggest you turn around before this turns ugly. Boys, roughhouse. That's how it goes. If that girl's bones are brittle, that's not my problem. Behind Jonas, Silas emitted a low, dangerous sound. Eli's fingers twitched. Ren stilled completely, calculating every angle of the room with that eerie precision of his. But Jonas only smiled, a slow, measured expression that had once made enemy officers rethink their loyalties. Here's how this is going to work, Mr. Tovrin, Jonas said softly. Your sons will apologize to Sira and her mother. They will take on community labor here in the outpost, real work. The kind that teaches them responsibility, and you will make damn sure they understand that what they did was wrong. That hurting someone weaker, no matter their species, status, or place in this community, has consequences. Dargan barked a laugh, sharp and disdainful. Or what, you and your 4 retirees going to force me? You think you can intimidate me in my own home? No, Jonas said. We're not going to touch you. His voice dropped to a near whisper. But I will make certain every person in this settlement knows exactly what happened. I'll make sure the Lumeri families know. The council will know. Every parent in New Meridian will understand that when your boys injure someone else's kid, people are willing to stand up to you instead of staying silent. He leaned in, his voice carrying the weight of a whole lifetime of conflict. I commanded a regiment in the Terran Vanguard during the Ashen Revolt. These men were my unit. We have contacts across 5 star systems. Union leaders, freight guild admins, mining oversight boards. We earned a reputation the hard way. And when we speak, people listen. He paused. So you can set things right now voluntarily. Or you can watch your family's standing crumble in this community, one quiet conversation at a time. You choose, Mr. Tovrin. A long silence filled the doorway, thick and brittle. Dargan stared at him, calculating, weighing whether this was a bluff. But something in Jonas's gaze, something carved out of old battlefields and sleepless nights, told him this wasn't a man who bluffed. Fine, Dargan said at last, voice tight with restrained fury. They'll apologize. They'll do your community work. But after that, you leave my family alone. After that, Jonas agreed, we'll have no reason to stay close to your sons until they learn what restraint actually means, Jonas said, his voice low but steady. He turned toward the doorway, ready to leave the Goric den behind. But before he could take a second step, the youngest boy, Zelek, all sharp ridges and fresh pride, lurched forward. His golden eyes burned with the mix of humiliation and anger only a teenager could possess. You can't just storm in here and posture like this, he snapped. You don't hold authority over us. Not here. Jonas paused, then pivoted slowly, studying the young Goric, with an expression that somehow softened. Without losing strength. Son, he said quietly, I'm not threatening you. If I were, the tone would be very different. Zelek's breath hitched, but Jonas continued with calm certainty. What I'm offering you is a chance far more valuable than the cheap thrill of picking on someone smaller. I'm offering you the chance to become the kind of person you'll be proud of one day. Someone stronger than cruelty. The boy's jaw worked silently. And trust me, Jonas added, the galaxy is drowning in people who hurt because they can. We don't need more of that. No one spoke after that. The Tovrin household let the silence swallow their anger. The veterans stepped back into the sun-baked alleys of New Meridian, their boots leaving faint prints in the rust-tinted dust. The twin star-rise painted long shadows behind them, stretching like memories no one wanted to revisit. That went smoother than I expected, Eli muttered at last. Honestly thought we'd end up throwing punches. Don't celebrate yet, Silas warned. Men like Dargan don't react well to being exposed in front of their own blood. He'll brood, twist the story, convince himself we violated some sacred boundary. Might even convince himself to push back. Let him, Ren said. We've survived worse worlds than this. Jonas didn't comment. His silence was heavier than the heat around them. He was thinking about the line he had drawn, another responsibility he hadn't planned to take on. Another fight he might have to see through. It was a burden he had hoped to bury long ago, but it settled across his shoulders with an old cold familiarity. They had done more than confront a bully. They had marked themselves as defenders in a settlement that preferred ignorance. They had invited risk into quiet lives. They had made themselves visible. But they had also sent a message, one that would spread through New Meridian faster than rumor. Cruelty had consequences. Vulnerability had guardians. Some boundaries still mattered. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a beginning. The following week, the humans made themselves impossible to ignore. Their planned departure was conveniently delayed. Everyone knew their grav bikes worked fine, and instead of leaving, they embedded themselves in the daily rhythm of the colony, focusing their efforts on the injured girl's family, the Halon clan. They started with what they could fix. The shattered perimeter rail destroyed the day young. Sirafel was rebuilt using scavenged alloy beams, reinforced and welded secure. The faulty air screen at the Halon front hatch was replaced with a pristine pressure seal. Ren quietly acquired from the mining depot's surplus bay. Silas installed a decommissioned military med monitor in Sierra's sleep alcove, a device he'd carried for months without reason. It synced with their comms, alerting them instantly if her vitals spiked or dipped. But their greatest contribution wasn't the repairs. It was presence. 5 hardened human veterans, unmistakable in their long coats and frontier gear, walking openly through the Halon district, the area the settlement usually preferred not to see, made a statement, louder than any speech. The vulnerable were not alone, not anymore. Sierra became the quiet heartbeat of New Meridian. Jonas visited every day carrying something small, a carved logic sphere, a data slate full of star myths, a packet of Terran root seeds unlikely to survive the iron soil but worth the attempt. The others followed his lead. Silas taught basic medical protocols to the Halon, neighbors, skills that could keep a colony alive when help was half a world away. Eli spent hours modifying the family's power junctions, increasing output and reducing their energy tolls significantly. And Ren, unexpectedly good with children, entertained Sierra with filtered stories from past conflicts, removing the darkness, keeping the bravery, making her laugh through the pain. On the 3rd day, under their father's rigid glare, the Tovran boys finally appeared at the Halon doorstep. A crowd gathered. Whispers followed. Their apology was stiff, practiced, and uncomfortable, but it was spoken aloud for all to witness. Rex, Darnik, and Zelik repeated the phrases drilled into them, each admitting what they had done, each stumbling over words they clearly didn't want to say. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And for New Meridian, that was monumental. The Tovran boys recited their rehearsed words stiffly, each one struggling through phrases of remorse and requests for forgiveness. Their mother, Mara, accepted the apology with a grace that disarmed the crowd, even offering a small nod of understanding. Little Sierra, dazed from her medication, only clutched her tiny stuffed hound closer and blinked sleepily at them, unaware of the weight the moment carried. But something far larger began to shift in the stillness after the boys. Voices faded. Doors cracked open. Faces emerged. Families who had stayed silent for too long stepped forward as though some invisible barrier had finally fractured. The Halon district, so often ignored, deferred, dismissed, was suddenly waking up. A Thanari mother, her feathered crest trembling with fear and fury, spoke openly about her daughter being excluded from the settlement academy. A graven pair, their mineral stone skin glinting under the harsh colony lights, revealed they had been denied housing approvals without explanation. Others followed, each voice adding weight to a truth that had been buried beneath dust and routine. Mistreatment had been happening everywhere. People simply hadn't allowed themselves to see it. Commander Jonas watched this unfolding tide of courage with mixed emotions. He had stepped in to defend one injured child, drawn one firm line in one forgotten corner of a frontier colony, but now the ripples were spreading, growing, escalating, and he no longer controlled where they would go. It was exhilarating and terrifying. "You understand what you've triggered, right?" Silas asked him one evening as they sat outside the Halon dwelling, watching the twin suns of Chorus Prime sink in slow mirrored descent. "This isn't going to stay small," he continued. "You just sparked a movement. Whether you meant to or not, everyone's going to look to us when things crack open." "I know," Jonas admitted quietly. "None of this was planned." Ren snorted softly. "You never plan anything. You leap first, then figure out how to land on the way down." Jonas let out a dry breath. We've all got our flaws, but inside a different truth stirred. For the first time since the war, since he'd folded up the last of his insignias and ghosted across the frontier, to carve out a quieter life, he felt purpose. He felt like he was doing something that mattered again, even if it was only shifting one settlement a few degrees toward fairness. 2 weeks after Sierra's injury, the Settlement Council called a public assembly. The official agenda listed resource allocation and supply chain projections, but everyone knew what the real topic would be: the growing tension between the long-established mining clans and the newer, poorer alien families. The meeting hall, an old cargo module retrofitted with benches and flickering hollow panels, filled quickly. Jonas and his men took seats in the back, a silent line of presence. Mara was there too, along with other families who had long lived on the margins. They looked anxious but resolute enough to be seen. The council members, mostly Gorek elders with a few humans whose ancestors had founded the colony, sat on a raised platform at the front, faces tight with discomfort. The meeting began with dry logistics: water quotas, machine maintenance, trade shipments. But the tension snapped sooner than expected. A Thanari woman stood, her wings trembling as she described her children being harassed in the academy halls. A Graven miner listed repeated refusals for fair job assignments. An elderly human colonist, older even than Jonas, spoke of newcomers being charged higher service fees than legacy families. And then Mara rose. Her tall, sweeping frame seemed to glow faintly under the weak lights, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with a mix of fear and determination. Her voice, thick with her native accent, filled the entire hall. "My daughter was gravely injured by boys who knew exactly what they intended," she said. "For days, no one asked how she was. No one checked if she lived. We were told to accept this because we are new here, because our lives weigh less than those who arrived first." She paused, turning her gaze across the hall, over those who looked away, over those who pretended neutrality, over those who had stayed silent. But then 5 strangers, 5 human veterans who owed us nothing, chose to stand with us. They demanded accountability when no one else would. They made sure we were seen. Her voice tightened. "So I must ask this community, why did it take outsiders to do what our own leaders should have done?" The silence was suffocating. Council members shifted. Old families avoided eye contact. Even Dargan, hulking in the front row, stared at the floor. Jonas hadn't planned to speak, but something in the stillness pushed him to his feet. "I am Jonas Hale," he said, steady and unembellished. "Formerly of the Terran Outer Operations Corps, my crew and I have drifted across half the frontier, from war zones to mining moons." His next words were beginning to take shape, and the hall braced for what was coming. 8 years he had wandered the frontier worlds, and he had seen the same story play out too many times. New settlements struggling to survive, turning on those most vulnerable because it was easier than facing systemic failures. Children injured or harassed ignored. Newcomers blamed for shortages. Cruelty excused as pragmatism. Jonas paused, letting his gaze sweep over the council, the weight of his presence filling the quiet. "You have a choice," he said slowly, voice firm but calm. "You can keep pretending that this settlement functions just fine, that no one suffers quietly in the corners, that what happened to Sierra Halon was an unfortunate accident. Or you can acknowledge that through inaction, you have created a space where cruelty is tolerated, where some children matter more than others, and where justice is determined by species or wealth." A sharp voice cut in. Zarak, a Krell woman overseeing the largest mining operation on the settlement, leaned forward, her scales glinting faintly in the hollow light. "And what exactly would you have us do about it? We are barely surviving here. We cannot waste resources on social programs or fairness initiatives. We need workers who produce, families who contribute. We cannot coddle every alien who wanders in seeking an easier life." "You're not being asked to coddle anyone," Jonas replied, his tone hardening. "I'm asking you to enforce the rules you claim to uphold. Investigate assaults, regardless of who the victim is. Protect children from harassment at school because of their species. Stop charging different rates for the same services based on how long a family has been here. Fairness, that's it. It's not complicated, it's not expensive. It just requires you to care." A low growl of frustration came from the front row. Dargan Tovrin, one of the influential miners, spoke with resentment thick in his voice. You don't live here. You don't make the hard calls about who gets resources and who does not. You ride in on your fancy bikes, stir up trouble, and ride away again. Jonas met his gaze without flinching. You're right. I am not responsible for this settlement. I don't live here. I don't work here. In a few days I'll leave and probably never return, but that doesn't make me wrong. And it doesn't give you the right to pretend mistreating people is necessary for survival. It's not. It's just convenient, and you've grown comfortable with convenient. The debate stretched on for another hour. Voices rose and fell, sharp accusations met with defensive retorts. But beneath the noise, something shifted. A subtle recognition settled into the council members, expressions things could not continue as they had. By the end, grudging concessions were made. A committee would be formed to handle complaints of discrimination. Standardized pricing would be enforced for essential services. School staff would undergo cultural sensitivity training. Small, imperfect steps, but steps nonetheless. Cracks had been made in the wall, and cracks could widen. When the council adjourned and the alien night bathed the settlement in its soft green glow, Mara approached Jonas, finding him near his bike, staring at the first stars flickering in Chorus Prime's sky. Thank you, she said simply, for all of this. For caring when you had no reason to. Jonas shook his head slowly. I had a reason, he said, voice quiet, almost to himself. A long time ago I had a daughter. She died in a transport accident with my wife before the war. She would have been about Sierra's age now. Every time I see a child hurt, I remember her. I think about the fact I couldn't protect her. Helping Sierra. Maybe it's the only way I can protect someone I actually can. Mara was silent for a moment, then reached out, her three-fingered hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Whatever your reasons, she said. Her tone firm yet gentle. You gave my daughter hope. You gave our community hope. That matters, Mr. Hale, more than you know. He didn't trust his voice, so he simply nodded. Around him, his team prepped their bikes, checked systems, secured cargo. Their delay had stretched long enough, Aldrich mining. Syndicate would soon demand delivery. He fired the engine, the familiar vibration resonating through his bones. But even as he lifted off the ground, his eyes lingered on the small prefab home. Inside, a 9-year-old alien girl was healing. Her stuffed hound sat beside her, waiting. And somewhere, in the quiet heart of New Meridian, a seed of hope had been planted, one that might just grow into something the settlement had never seen before. Bristle tucked safely beside her, where a mother clung to the fragile hope that tomorrow might finally be better than today. And in that quiet moment, Jonas made a decision. Ren, he called softly over the comm link, his voice low but firm. Chart a new route. We'll be coming back through New Meridian in about 6 weeks, after we wrap up the Aldrich delivery. Why? Ren asked, though there was a faint smile in his tone. Betraying the answer he already suspected. Because I want to check on Sierra, Jonas said. See that she's healing properly. Make sure the settlement council actually followed through on their promises. Right, Ren replied, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. Just a wellness check. Nothing to do with the fact that we've practically adopted an entire frontier settlement. Plot the course, Ren, that's an order, Jonas said. Half teasing, but even he knew Ren wasn't wrong. Over the next half year, New Meridian became a regular waypoint for Jonas's team. Each stop had a reason. Equipment maintenance, supplies updates, or simply lending a hand. And every visit included checking on Sierra's progress, supporting Mara's leadership among the Lumeri community, and quietly reinforcing the idea that these families were not invisible. Sierra's recovery was methodical. The regenerative brace repaired her broken leg with surgical precision, but the psychological scars lingered. Nightmares of falling, of being shoved, of helplessness haunted her sleep. Jonas and his men, especially Silas with his medical expertise, guided her through these fears. They taught her breathing exercises, cognitive reframing, and gentle exposure techniques, the same strategies they had used with soldiers traumatized by war. By the 4th month, she was walking again, hesitant at first, then with increasing confidence. By the 5th, she returned to school, supported by protections and accommodations previously unseen in the settlement. By the 6th month, she was running freely, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with delight. Bristle, the small stuffed hound, perched loyally on her bed as ever. The settlement itself changed, gradually but meaningfully. Harassment incidents dropped as parents and teachers became more vigilant. The Lumeri and other immigrant families built mutual support networks, sharing resources and knowledge. The council, perhaps recognizing that fairness cost far less than social unrest, implemented most of their promised reforms. Word spread. Other colonies learned of the small, frontier settlement where 5 human veterans had stood up for a child, and a community had been forced to confront its biases. Some dismissed it as idealism. Others found inspiration. Jonas tried not to dwell on the wider consequences, focusing instead on the tangible and practical. Yet in quiet moments, he allowed himself the realization they had changed more than a single settlement. They had demonstrated that intervention worked, that a determined individual or a small team could challenge injustice, that entrenched cruelty was not unassailable. They had shown that courage combined with compassion created a strength unlike any other, a power to heal, to build, to open possibilities rather than close them down. On their 7th visit, nearly 8 months after Sira's accident, Jonas sat on the porch of the Halon home as Chorus, Prime's twin sons, sank in their synchronized descent. Sira laughed and played with other children, fully healed, her joy echoing across the dusty streets. Mara sat beside him, her bioluminescent patterns glowing softly as the twilight settled over New Meridian. "She has forgotten to be afraid," Mara said quietly, awe and relief lacing her tone. "I didn't think it was possible," Jonas replied, a small smile touching his lips. "Kids have more resilience than most adults give them credit for." "It's not just her resilience," Mara said, turning slightly to meet his gaze. "It's knowing people stood up for her, that what happened mattered, that she wasn't alone. You gave her that, Mr. Hale. You and your men. You gave her hope, and that changes everything." Jonas Hale watched Sira dart across the dusty courtyard, her laughter ringing clear and unburdened, her small feet kicking up motes of golden light from the twin suns. For the first time in months, he saw her simply being a child, free, joyful, untethered from the fear and pain that had shadowed her since the accident. Around him his men moved quietly, tending to their hover bikes and supplies, giving space but keeping watch. "It matters," Mara said softly, her gaze following her daughter, "knowing there are people out there willing to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. You and your men, you gave Sira that." Jonas nodded slowly, a warmth spreading through his chest he hadn't felt in years. "We all need to know someone has our back," he admitted, voice low. "Maybe that's what I've been looking for too. All those years of fighting, all the chaos and loss. I wanted to know it meant something, that even now we could still do some good." "You've done more than good," Mara said, her voice steady. "You changed lives. You changed this settlement. You showed people that caring is powerful, that it can shift the impossible into the possible." Jonas remained silent for a while, letting the words settle, letting the warm evening breeze brush across his weathered face. He watched the children playing, the settlement slowly coming alive with the routines of evening, his men working quietly at the edge of the scene. And in that calm he felt it, a peace he had not known since the war, a rare and precious stillness that filled the spaces left by years of loss and regret, not because the galaxy had been made right, not because every injustice had been undone, not because every wrong could be punished or fixed, but because he had done something that mattered. He had stood when it was easier to walk away. He had helped someone who could not protect herself. He had drawn a line and he had held it. And that, he realized, was enough. In a universe so vast, so indifferent, where suffering often passed unnoticed, those small acts, kindness, courage, defense of the weak, were the threads that held civilization together. They were the difference between chaos and order, cruelty and compassion, despair and hope. One small stand could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone could see. As the stars pierced the darkening sky over Chorus Prime, the settlement's lights flickering to life against the approaching night, Jonas allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. Bristle the hound, worn and patched but faithful, sat beside Sira, her small hands holding the toy as if it had always belonged to her. And for the first time in a long time, Jonas felt he had found a reason worth living for. Not redemption, because some things could never be reclaimed, but a purpose close enough to it. Something worth fighting for in a galaxy that desperately needed people who still cared. And for now, that was enough. It had to be enough.